Hi, I'm Tracy Klarner, and today we're going to be talking about gender socialization. Do you ever wonder what your world would be like had you been raised by someone else? How would you be affected if someone else was teaching you about life? Do you ever think about how you came to feel the way you do about yourself? How you developed your liking for certain things and disliking of others? Your primary caregiver may have had something to do with it, or society as a whole. At what point were you certain about what it meant to be a boy versus a girl? And what behavior did you assume as a result of this realization? I asked 13 participants to answer some of these questions. First, we'll look at our thesis statement. Parental and societal behaviors directly affect a person's idea of what constitutes being a male versus a female. You are a product of your environment. There are behavioral expectations that are passed down by parents and supported by society. We're reminded in our text how society often denounces being a woman as if it were a handicap. Men are taught to be a real man. They must not emulate a female. As young children, we're taught gender in many of the activities we're encouraged to participate in. We are directed towards certain activities that may be deemed appropriate for our gender role. The participants in this study were questioned about their primary caregivers, childhood activities, gender enforcement statements, and their current situations. Our text states the following. Parents' communication towards sons and daughters often reflects the parents' gender stereotypes. Some parents communicate different expectations about achievement to sons versus daughters. Parents also convey distinct messages about assertiveness and aggressiveness to sons and daughters. Because of gender socialization, however, they learn different ways of expressing those particular feelings. First, let's look at our study participants. We have 13 altogether, 6 of which are female. The median age for our females is 37 years old. 4 were Caucasian, 1 was African American, and 1 would fall into our other category. Of the male participants, there were 7. Their median age was 40 years old. 4 were Caucasian, 2 were African American, and again, 1 would also fall into that other category as well. First, we're going to take a look at the women that I interviewed. 4 of the 6 women interviewed were raised by both of their parents. When it came to which parent was the driving force in their upbringing, 2 stated their fathers, 2 stated their mothers, and 2 stated both parents. So there really wasn't an underlying theme with these 6 participants because they were equally socialized by either one or both parents. So I went on to ask the women certain questions in reference to activities and toys when they were a child. When asked what toys they were encouraged to play with as a child, 5 of the women stated baby dolls and Barbies. The majority of women were encouraged to play outdoors, but only 2 of the females surveyed were actually encouraged to participate in sports. Then when asked about the activities that they were discouraged as a child, most participants only mentioned that they were not to play violent games or use weapons, but they really don't remember anything else really being discouraged as a child. Looking at our textbook, it states the following. The focus on appearance begins in the early years of life, when girls are given dolls and clothes, both of which invite them to attend to appearance. Dolls, like the ever-popular Barbie, come with accessories such as extensive wardrobes, so girls learn that clothes and jewelry are important at a very young age. They're also encouraged to play with baby dolls very often, which, again, puts them in the role of caregiver and mother and homemaker, and these are the type of activities that are typically encouraged in little girls. The women were also questioned as to what they wanted to be when they grew up. They were asked if gender role played any part of this decision. Now, all of the women responded no to that question, but their answers somewhat indicate otherwise. Several of the women wanted to be teachers, 1 a nurse, another an actress, and the last a flight attendant. All of these job choices have been historically acceptable or even preferred for a woman versus a man. Now, instinctively, they may feel like gender played no part in their decision to make this their childhood choice of what they wanted to be when they grew up, but it's very likely that just from the behaviors and societal norms at the time, these may have been ideal job choices for them. And to quote one of my participants, she is a 25-year-old teacher, she stated, my upbringing has affected how I view my gender and the roles slightly. Example, the role of cooking. I was raised that the woman of the house is expected to cook every meal, but fortunately, I get help from my husband, and it's not all of my responsibility. I also had the expectation that my husband would be responsible for paying our bills on time and whatnot. I'm actually responsible for this now. This particular participant grew up in a home where her father was the sole provider and her mother was a homemaker. Her mother encouraged her to cook and to take care of the children, and that this was likely a role that she would fall into as a wife and mother as she grew to be older. She found when she became a teacher, she's married, and that this isn't really the roles that she falls into right now, but it still sticks in the back of her mind. As she said in her quote, she feels fortunate that she gets help from her husband, and it isn't all of her responsibility. Many other women may not see themselves as fortunate, but just as an everyday occurrence that their husband would participate in these activities. Again, something that someone might assume because of the way that they were brought up. Now let's take a look at the men I interviewed. 6 out of the 7 interviewed were raised by both parents. When asked which parent was the driving force in their upbringing, 4 responded their mothers, 2 said their fathers, and 1 stated both. So, underlying theme here is actually that the majority of our men that were interviewed were actually listed their mother as the driving force in their upbringing. A little bit different than what we found with the women. So now we will look at the questions that I asked the men pertaining to toys and activities that they were encouraged to do as a child. When asked what toys they were encouraged to play with as a child, all of my participants that were male stated G.I. Joes, Army men, or toy cars. All of the participants also mentioned bicycles. The majority of the men surveyed were encouraged to participate in outdoor activities by their parents, most often a sport. So we look at, when we spoke with the females earlier, they were all encouraged to go outside and play, but there was never really any encouragement to be in a sport. You kind of find the opposite here with the men. When asked what activities or toys they were discouraged from playing with as a child, 4 said that they were not discouraged to do anything. However, 3 of the participants stated playing with dolls would not have been acceptable, and 1 participant mentioned playing house was forbidden by his father. I thought this was an interesting picture, so I included this here in the slide, but this is actually a little boy who is mimicking his mother breastfeeding a baby. And so I'm sure many of you might know some dads or men that would find this to be unacceptable and would likely correct their son if they were to see their son playing with a baby in this manner. I also discussed with the men what they wanted to be when they grew up as children. When they were asked this, 4 of them wished to be professional athletes, 1 of them wished to be a Navy SEAL, 1 wished to be a professional singer, and 1 wanted to be president. When they were asked if gender played a role in their choices, 5 of them responded yes. So unlike the women who really said that gender played no part in the role that they chose as far as what they wanted to be when they grew up, it was quite opposite with the men. The men just said, yes, my gender did help me decide what it was that I wanted to be when I grew up. So I also asked the men about any specific gender lessons that they may have learned as a child. 5 of the men questioned advised me that they were taught it's a man's job to provide for his family. 4 of the men also advised me that they were taught to be tough. When asked if they were advised at a young age to be strong like a man or not to be a sissy, 6 of the men agreed. 1 of the participants, who was raised only by a single mother, was taught this by his older brother. So there again, even in situations where there's no father present, society, peers, even brothers, sisters, can make a point of still encouraging the same behavior, and it doesn't necessarily have to be by a parent, but someone in an influential role. So I asked my participants how they felt their upbringing affected how they view their gender role. And I was kind of surprised by the two quotes that I have here. The youngest man that I surveyed responded as follows. He felt, I feel my upbringing molded me into the man I am, so I feel like it's what I will do when I have kids. I don't want to raise a boy who's into Barbies and wants to dance. I believe this was a 27-year-old man that responded this answer. However, the oldest man that I surveyed, who would be 61 years old, responded as follows. Quote, it hindered my growth as a human being. He went on to explain that growing up in a home with a traditional 1950s family where the father provided and the mother tended to the home and the children, it didn't allow him to see the possibilities that both women and men can reach outside of these stereotypes until he grew older and had experienced a life himself. So he felt like he might have had maybe a misconception of what the traditional family was supposed to be like and the ideal family in his head, but actually when he went to grow up and live his own life, he found that this actually isn't the case, and most families don't conform to this ideal traditional 1950s family style. All right, so looking back at our textbook again, the text states the following. Society's expectations for both men and women continue to change, and these changes provoke anxiety and confusion about how to be a man today. Men's traditional role as provider and protector is no longer the solid anchor it once was, and strong new anchors have not been found or created. There's been few models that have come forward that men can hold to. It's almost as if every man for himself now. And this just kind of goes into the confusion that maybe a man feels because he's brought up to be taught to be tough and strong and the protector and the provider. And oftentimes that doesn't really work with how society is today and how these traditional roles really are not present anymore like they were in the 1950s. There are still some that are present, but it is not the overwhelming majority like it once was. And so men are trying to find what that role is now and feel more comfortable in reaching those expectations that they feel they have to reach as a man. Okay, so I want to review our main points again. The questionnaire supports the assertion that primary caregivers were seen as influential in the participants' sense of self and what they deemed appropriate for their gender. Those that I interviewed were influenced by their parents, and most would raise their children as they were raised. Most of the female participants did not feel that gender played a role in what they originally wanted to be when they grew up, yet the jobs they chose were likened and highly acceptable for females. Most male participants did feel that gender played a role in what they originally wanted to be when they grew up. Most of these job choices were also likened and highly acceptable for males, exemplifying the toughness that men are encouraged to display. Now, looking at my own personal experience versus the results from my questionnaire, in my own experience, I've had very similar upbringing to many of those interviewed. I had both of my parents in my life. Both were driving forces in my upbringing. I was given dolls and Barbies to play with. I was not discouraged for many activities, but not necessarily encouraged either. I was encouraged to be ladylike. I was also encouraged to go outside, yet I was never encouraged to play in a sport. Now, having divorced parents, I was not privy to the idea that the man provides, as my mother also worked full-time and provided for my siblings and I. I can say by watching my parents work very hard to raise their children, a strong work ethic has been instilled in me. Although I do work 2 jobs, I provide for my family on my own, my parents were very influential in my worldview and my belief system. And in conclusion, to restate our thesis again, parental and societal behaviors directly affect a person's idea of what constitutes being a male versus a female. You are a product of your environment. Parents have a profound effect on the beliefs and actions of their children. Whether directly taught or simply by observation, children will often mimic the views and actions of their parents. These things are often assumed to be right or true simply because a child looks to their parent or caregiver for guidance and life lessons. As adults and caregivers, we must take this into account when raising our children. Our words and actions can have lasting effects on our children and their worldview.